September 1818. The Yorkshire countryside lay blanketed in early autumn mist, clinging to the rolling hills like secrets refusing to be revealed. In a modest stone cottage on the outskirts of Harrogate, Margaret Isabel Lawson stood at the window, watching her two sons chase each other through the small garden, their laughter piercing the morning silence with innocent joy. At 27, Margaret had learned to live with fear as a constant companion. 6 years she had hidden here, teaching her boys to answer to false names. Henry and Edward knew nothing of their true heritage, nothing of the title that should have been theirs, nothing of the father who had died at Waterloo before ever holding them. Furthermore, Margaret had ensured their childhood isolation by maintaining a cautious distance from the few sympathetic friends Giles may have possessed, knowing she utterly lacked the financial means or social capital to challenge a peer of the realm in court. The letter in her trembling hands changed everything. If stories of courage born from desperation move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You won't want to miss what happens next. Richard Charles Thornbury, Earl of Wycliffe, requested her immediate presence at Wycliffe Park in Derbyshire. Not requested, she corrected herself, commanded. The tone was unmistakable, the implications terrifying. He knew about the boys. Mama! Henry appeared at her elbow, his dark eyes so like his father's that her heart clenched. Why are you crying? She had not realized tears were falling. Margaret knelt, gathering both twins close, breathing in the scent of grass and childhood that clung to them. Sometimes adults cry when they remember people they loved, she said softly. Your papa would be so proud of the fine young men you are becoming. Tell us again about Papa, Edward pleaded as he always did. But there was no time for stories now. The Earl's letter specified she was to arrive within the week. 3 days had already passed since its delivery. Margaret had never met Richard Thornbury. He had been fighting Napoleon's forces when she married his younger brother Giles in a secret ceremony 7 years ago. Giles had insisted on the secrecy then, fearing his family's reaction to his choice of a mere gentleman's daughter with a modest dowry. He had promised to reveal their union after the war, to bring her proudly to his family home. Instead, he had died on a battlefield in Belgium, and Margaret had discovered herself pregnant and alone. The memory of Lady Constance Thornbury's face still haunted her nightmares. Giles's aunt had appeared at Margaret's door 6 weeks after Waterloo, her expression cold as winter stone. My nephew's foolish infatuation is unfortunate, she had said, examining the marriage certificate with barely concealed disdain. But this piece of paper means nothing. A secret wedding witnessed by common soldiers. The family will never recognize such a union. Those bastards you carry will be taken from you the moment they are born. Better you disappear now, and spare yourself the humiliation. So Margaret had disappeared. She had fled to Yorkshire, assumed the name Mrs. Lawson, and found work as a governess. She had given birth alone in a charitable hospital, raised her sons in obscurity, and taught herself to live with the constant terror of discovery. Now discovery had found her anyway. The journey to Derbyshire took 2 days by mail coach, with the twins wide-eyed at every new sight. They had never travelled beyond the boundaries of Harrogate. Margaret held them close, wondering if she was bringing them to safety or delivering them into the very danger she had fled. Wycliffe Park rose from the Derbyshire landscape like something from a dream, all grey stone and mullioned windows, surrounded by grounds that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The carriage that had collected them from the coaching inn wound up a long drive lined with ancient oaks, their branches creating a canopy overhead that filtered the afternoon sun into patterns of light and shadow. Is this a castle, Mama? Henry whispered, pressing his face to the carriage window. It is a very grand house, Margaret replied, her voice steadier than her hands. Mind your manners, both of you. Remember what I taught you about proper behavior. A stern-faced butler admitted them to a great hall that smelled of beeswax and old wood. Portraits of Thornbury ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow Margaret as she was led deeper into the house. The twins clung to her skirts, their earlier excitement replaced by nervous uncertainty. Mrs. Lawson, the butler announced, his tone making clear what he thought of her presumed status. And the children. The library was magnificent. 2 stories of books bound in leather reaching toward a ceiling painted with classical scenes. But Margaret had eyes only for the man who rose from behind an enormous desk, tall and imposing in dark, superfine wool. Richard Charles Thornbury, Earl of Wycliffe, looked nothing like his younger brother. Where Giles had been golden and laughing, quick to smile and quicker to embrace life, this man was all restraint and discipline. His dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples. His face was austere, marked by lines that spoke of years spent in the arduous campaigns of war. His grey eyes assessed her with the cold precision of a military commander evaluating a potential threat. "Mrs. Lawson," he said, his voice deep and controlled. "Or should I say Mrs. Giles Thornbury?" Margaret lifted her chin, refusing to cower despite the trembling in her limbs. "I am Margaret Thornbury, legally wed to your brother on the 7th of March, 1811, in the chapel at Wycliffe Park. I have the certificate and witnesses to prove it." "I have seen the certificate," the Earl replied, "along with letters my brother wrote during the Peninsular Campaign, letters in which he mentioned a wife and anticipated children." He paused, his gaze dropping to the twins. "These are his sons." It was not a question. The resemblance was undeniable. Both boys had inherited Giles's dark eyes, his strong features, his bearing. "Henry and Edward," Margaret confirmed, placing a protective hand on each small shoulder. "They are 6 years old, my lord, and they are everything to me." "They are the only male heirs to the Wycliffe title," Richard said bluntly. "My elder brother died of fever 3 years ago, without issue. My service took me to remote post-war duties that delayed my full return, and my ability to dedicate my time to the succession matters until my final discharge a few months prior." He moved around the desk, his movements precise and controlled. "Then I discovered, through investigation, that my youngest brother had in fact married and produced sons before his death." The threat hung unspoken in the air between them. Henry instinctively pressed closer to her side. "Why did you hide them?" The Earl's tone was not accusatory but genuinely curious. "Why not come forward and claim your rightful place as my brother's widow?" "Because your aunt threatened to take them from me," Margaret said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "Lady Constance Thornbury appeared at my door after Waterloo and told me that the family would never recognize the marriage, that my sons would be declared illegitimate and taken away. I was young, alone, and terrified. So I did the only thing I could think of. I disappeared." Something flickered in the Earl's eyes. Not sympathy precisely, but perhaps understanding. "My aunt," he said slowly, "has always been protective of family interests, sometimes excessively so." "She threatened my children," Margaret replied, her fear transforming into anger. "She would have stolen them from me to control the succession. Do not ask me to regret protecting my sons from such cruelty." "I do not ask that." The Earl returned to his desk, retrieving a stack of documents. "I have spent the past month investigating your claims and my aunt's actions. The marriage is legitimate. The boys are legitimate heirs. Lady Constance acted entirely without family authority or approval when she threatened you." Hope and terror warred in Margaret's chest. "Then why am I here, my lord?" "Because we have a problem." Richard spread the documents across the desk. "Under English law, as a widow, you have limited rights over your sons. As their uncle and head of the family, I have the legal authority to claim custody. The courts would support me without question." The solid ground beneath her seemed to vanish. Margaret grasped the back of a chair to steady herself. "You mean to take them from me?" "I mean," the Earl said carefully, "to give you a choice." He met her gaze directly, his expression unreadable. "Your sons need education appropriate to their station. They need to understand their heritage and responsibilities. They need the protection of the Wycliffe name and fortune. All of this I can provide." "They need their mother," Margaret whispered. "Yes," he agreed. "They do. Which is why I am offering you a solution, though I warn you it is not an easy one." He paused, seeming to choose his words with care. "Marry me, Margaret. Become my wife and the Countess of Wycliffe. Your sons will have both parents, a recognized place in society, and every advantage their birth entitles them to. You will have legal protection, financial security, and the authority that comes with being my countess." Margaret stared at him, certain she had misheard. You jest, my lord. I'm entirely serious. The Earl's expression remained grave. I need heirs. Your sons are the rightful heirs to this title. Marriage to me legitimizes their position beyond any possible question and provides them with the upbringing they deserve. It also solves my own succession crisis. You speak of marriage as though it were a business arrangement, Margaret said faintly. Is that not what many marriages are, particularly in our class? Richard replied. I am 38 years old, Mrs. Thornbury. I spent 15 years fighting Napoleon. 15 years of war offer no quarter for romantic expectations. I value utility and honor above sentiment. What I am offering is an expedient resolution to our shared predicaments. And comfort, Margaret asked. Shared esteem. All the things one might hope for in marriage. I do not think either of us has the luxury of romantic notions, Richard replied. But I can promise you respect, courtesy, and fidelity. I will honor my vows and expect you to do the same. Beyond that, we need not pretend to feelings neither of us possesses. It was the loneliest proposal of marriage Margaret could imagine. Yet what alternative did she truly have? She thought of Giles, who had loved her with such passion and joy, who had made her laugh and dream and believe in happiness. This man was nothing like his brother. There would be no laughter here, no joy, no dreams, only duty and survival, but her sons would be safe. That was what mattered. I accept your proposal, my lord, Margaret said quietly. For the sake of my children, I will marry you. Something that might have been relief crossed the Earl's face. Then we shall be married in 3 weeks' time. That will give you time to prepare and for the banns to be read. 3 weeks, Margaret repeated numbly. I see no reason for delay. Richard's tone was businesslike again. In the meantime, you and the boys will remain here. I will introduce them to the estate and begin their education in what it means to be Thornbury heirs. And so it was decided. Margaret Isabel Lawson would become Margaret Thornbury, Countess of Wycliffe, in a loveless marriage of convenience to a man who viewed her as a practical solution to an inconvenient problem. You have until tomorrow morning, the Earl replied. I will have rooms prepared for you and the boys. We will dine together this evening, and you may give me your answer at breakfast. It was not really time to think. It was merely time to accept the inevitable. Margaret drifted to the enormous desk, resting a trembling hand upon the heavy mahogany. The stillness of the library now felt suffocating, its leather-bound volumes silent judges of her impossible decision. He had left her with a choice that was no choice at all, a gilded cage or utter destitution and the loss of her sons. The full weight of his authority, backed by the law, settled over her spirit like a stone. That evening, Margaret dressed for dinner in the best gown she possessed, a simple grey silk that had seen better days. A maid had been assigned to assist her, a young woman named Sarah who chattered nervously as she arranged Margaret's dark hair into a simple knot. His lordship has been ever so busy since returning from the wars, Sarah confided. The estate had been neglected something terrible while he was away, but he has put everything to rights with such efficiency. All the staff say he is a fair master, stern but just. Margaret said little, her mind churning with impossible choices. Through the window she could see Henry and Edward playing in the formal gardens under the watchful eye of a footman. They looked so small against the vastness of Wycliffe Park, two little boys who had no idea their entire world was about to change. Dinner was served in a cavernous dining room that could have accommodated 50 guests but felt empty, with only 2 people seated at opposite ends of a table laden with silver and crystal. Richard's cravat was perfectly tied, and his manner formally correct. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the clink of silverware. The boys seem well adjusted, he observed as the first course was served. You have clearly been a devoted mother. They are everything to me, Margaret replied, pushing food around her plate without appetite. Every decision I have made for 6 years has been to protect them. I understand that. Richard set down his fork, regarding her seriously across the expanse of polished mahogany. I want you to know that I genuinely believe this marriage is the best solution for everyone involved. I do not say that to pressure you, but to assure you of my sincere intent. You offer me security and status, Margaret said slowly, but what do you gain beyond heirs you could easily produce with any number of willing young ladies of appropriate rank? Expedience, he answered bluntly. I am not inclined toward courtship or the marriage market. I have responsibilities that require my attention. A ready-made family solves my difficulties without the tedium of navigating society's expectations. It was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had ever said to her about marriage. There was something almost refreshing in his directness, even as it underscored the coldness of his proposal. And comfort? Margaret asked. Shared esteem? All the things one might hope for in marriage? I do not think either of us has the luxury of romantic notions, Richard replied, but I can promise you respect, courtesy, and fidelity. I will honor my vows and expect you to do the same. Beyond that, we need not pretend to feelings neither of us possesses. It was the loneliest proposal of marriage Margaret could imagine. Yet what alternative did she truly have? She thought of Giles, who had loved her with such passion and joy, who had made her laugh and dream and believe in happiness. This man was nothing like his brother. There would be no laughter here, no joy, no dreams, only duty and survival. But her sons would be safe. That was what mattered. I accept your proposal, my lord, Margaret said quietly. For the sake of my children, I will marry you. Something that might have been relief crossed the Earl's face. Then we shall be married in 3 weeks' time. That will give you time to prepare and for the banns to be read. 3 weeks, Margaret repeated numbly. I see no reason for delay. Richard's tone was businesslike again. In the meantime, you and the boys will remain here. I will introduce them to the estate and begin their education in what it means to be Thornbury heirs. And so it was decided. Margaret Isabel Lawson would become Margaret Thornbury, Countess of Wycliffe, in a loveless marriage of convenience to a man who viewed her as a practical solution to an inconvenient problem. The following weeks passed in a blur of preparations. Margaret was measured for new gowns appropriate to her soon-to-be station, though she insisted they be simple and not extravagant. The Earl assigned her rooms in the family wing, a suite that had belonged to his mother, with high ceilings and windows overlooking the rose garden. Henry and Edward adjusted to their new circumstances with the resilience of childhood. Richard proved surprisingly patient with them, allowing them to explore the estate and beginning to teach them about agriculture, land management, and the responsibilities that would one day be theirs. Margaret watched him with the boys and saw hints of gentleness beneath the austere exterior. Your uncle will be your guardian and stepfather, she explained to them one evening as they prepared for bed. He is a good man who wants to ensure you are properly cared for. Will he be our new papa? Edward asked, his small face serious. He will be married to Mama, Henry added. That makes him our papa, does it not? Margaret's throat tightened. You had a papa who loved you very much, even though he never got to meet you. Lord Richard will be your stepfather. You may call him whatever feels right to you. But she noticed that within days, both boys were following Richard around the estate, peppering him with questions, seeking his approval. And Richard, for all his stern reserve, answered patiently and showed them kindnesses that suggested he was not as cold as he seemed. 2 days before the wedding, Lady Constance Thornbury arrived unannounced. Margaret was in the morning room reviewing the household accounts that would soon be her responsibility when the commotion erupted in the entrance hall. She recognized that imperious voice immediately, and ice flooded her veins. Where is she? Lady Constance demanded. Where is that scheming creature who has bewitched my nephew? Margaret stood on trembling legs as Richard's aunt swept into the morning room, resplendent in burgundy silk and righteous fury. She looked exactly as Margaret remembered, handsome features twisted by disdain, eyes cold as winter. You, Lady Constance spat, you dare show your face here. You dare pretend to be... That is enough. Richard's voice cut through his aunt's tirade like a blade. He appeared in the doorway, his expression harder than Margaret had yet seen it. You will control yourself in my house, Aunt Constance, or you will leave immediately. Control myself? Lady Constance whirled on him. Richard, you cannot possibly believe her lies. A secret marriage, documents that could easily be forgeries. She is nothing but a fortune hunter who... I have verified every detail of her story, Richard interrupted coldly. The marriage was legitimate. The boys are legitimate. And you, Aunt Constance, threatened to steal my brother's children based on nothing but your own prejudice and desire for control. I was protecting the family, Lady Constance insisted, though her confidence seemed to waver. Protecting you from being trapped by a scheming... You drove away my brother's widow and deprived his sons of their rightful heritage, Richard said, each word precisely enunciated. You acted without authority or consultation. Whatever you believed you were protecting, it was not the family's best interests. Lady Constance's face flushed with anger. Those children are bastards. That marriage certificate means nothing. Common soldiers as witnesses? A ceremony performed in secret? No respectable family would recognize... I recognize it, Richard stated flatly. That is all that matters. In 3 days, Mrs. Thornbury will become my wife and the Countess of Wycliffe. Those boys will be raised as my sons and the heirs they were born to be. You are welcome to accept this gracefully, or you may leave my presence and not return. Richard, I only ever wanted what was best for you, for the family. Surely you can see that this woman, Lady Constance pleaded. I see a devoted mother who has raised my brother's children alone under the most difficult circumstances, Richard said. I see a woman of considerable strength and dignity, and I see that my aunt's interference nearly caused irreparable harm to innocent children. Margaret watched the confrontation with her heart in her throat. She had expected Richard to defend the marriage for practical reasons, but there was something in his tone that suggested genuine anger on her behalf. Lady Constance seemed to realize she had lost. Her face settled into tight lines of disapproval. I wash my hands of this entire affair, she announced. When it all ends in disaster, do not say I did not warn you. She swept from the room in a rustle of silk and wounded pride. Richard remained motionless until the sound of her carriage departing echoed from outside. I apologize for that scene, he said finally, turning to Margaret. My aunt has always been overly concerned with family reputation. I had hoped she would show more grace. You defended me, Margaret said, still shaken. You did not have to do that so forcefully. She was wrong, Richard replied simply. And she hurt you and frightened you when you were most vulnerable. That is unforgivable in my eyes. It was the first time he had shown real emotion regarding their situation, and Margaret found herself seeing him differently, not as a cold strategist, but as a man with his own code of honor, his own sense of justice. Thank you, she said softly. He inclined his head. We are to be married, Margaret. That means your enemies become mine. I protect what is mine. The words should have sounded possessive. Instead, they sounded like a vow. The wedding took place on a grey October morning in the small chapel where Margaret had married Giles 7 years before. The irony was not lost on her as she walked down the same aisle in a simple gown of ivory silk, her hand on Richard's arm instead of her first husband's. The ceremony was brief and formal. Richard's responses were measured, his hand steady as he placed the ring on her finger. Margaret's voice shook slightly as she repeated her vows, very aware that this was binding her to a stranger for the rest of her life. The vicar pronounced them man and wife. Richard lifted her veil and placed a measured kiss on her cheek, his lips barely grazing her skin. Countess, he murmured, and she realized with a shock that it was true. She was now the Countess of Wycliffe, one of the highest-ranking ladies in the county. A small wedding breakfast followed, attended only by Richard's steward, the vicar, and a handful of senior servants. Henry and Edward sat on either side of their mother, unusually quiet, sensing the solemnity of the occasion. Are you truly married to Uncle Richard now? Henry asked. Yes, darling, Margaret confirmed. He is my husband and your guardian. Good, Edward said with the simple certainty of childhood. I like it here, and Uncle Richard showed me how to fish yesterday. Margaret met Richard's gaze across the table and saw something that might have been warmth in those grey eyes. Perhaps this would not be the cold arrangement she had feared. Perhaps they might find some measure of companionship, if not love. That evening, Margaret stood in her dressing gown in the Countess's chambers, her hands trembling as she brushed out her hair. The connecting door to the Earl's rooms stood closed, but unlocked. She knew what was expected of her on her wedding night. She had fulfilled these duties before with Giles, though that had been born of passion and mutual desire. This would be different. This was obligation, the price of security and protection. The knock on the connecting door made her start. Come in, she called, her voice steadier than she felt. Richard entered wearing a dark dressing gown, his hair slightly damp from washing. He looked different without the formal clothing and precisely tied cravat. More human somehow, less the stern Earl, and more simply, a man. "Margaret," he said quietly, remaining by the door. "I want to be clear about expectations. I do not expect you to feel anything beyond what we have agreed to. This is a marriage of convenience and mutual benefit. If you prefer to keep separate chambers, I will respect that choice." Margaret stared at him, surprised. "You would not insist on your rights?" "I would prefer a willing partner to a dutiful one," Richard replied. "We can wait until you are more comfortable, if that is your preference. There is no urgency regarding heirs, given that your sons will inherit regardless." It was so unexpected, so considerate, that Margaret felt something soften in her chest. Giles had been passionate and impulsive, sweeping her off her feet with declarations and romance. This man offered her choice, respect, patience. "I do not wish for a cold marriage," Margaret heard herself say. "We are married now, my lord. Perhaps we might at least attempt to build something real between us." Richard's expression shifted, something like relief crossing his features. "I would like that very much." He crossed the room slowly, giving her time to change her mind. When he reached her, he cupped her face gently in his hands, his touch surprisingly tender. "May I kiss you properly, wife?" "Yes," Margaret whispered. His lips met hers with a gentleness that contradicted his stern exterior. There was no passion, not yet, but there was respect and care. When he drew back, his grey eyes searched her face. "Are you certain about this?" he asked. "We need not rush." But Margaret found she wanted this connection, this attempt at intimacy with the man who had shown her more consideration in 3 weeks than she had any right to expect. "I am certain," she said, and took his hand to lead him toward the bed. The days that followed established new patterns. Richard rose early to manage estate business, returning for breakfast with the family. Margaret began learning the extensive responsibilities of being countess, meeting with the housekeeper, reviewing accounts, planning menus. The boys started lessons with a tutor Richard hired, a kind elderly gentleman who understood how to teach without crushing curiosity. He was a former military chaplain whose gentle discipline Richard trusted implicitly. In the evenings they dined together, sometimes just the two of them after the boys were abed. Richard proved to be surprisingly good company when he relaxed his guard. He spoke of his years in the military, of places he had seen and battles he had fought. Margaret told him of the clever ways she had made ends meet in Yorkshire, of the challenges of raising twins alone. "You are far stronger than you give yourself credit for," Richard observed one evening as they sat in the library, she with embroidery and he with estate correspondence. "To have survived those years with your dignity and tact is remarkable." "I did what any mother would do," Margaret replied. "No," Richard said quietly. "Many would have crumbled. You did not. That speaks to considerable character." It was not love, not yet, but it was respect, and Margaret found that respect could be a foundation for something more substantial than passion alone. 6 weeks after their marriage, Richard announced they would travel to London for the little season. "It is important that society sees us together," he explained. "That they understand your position as my countess is absolute. There will be gossip, of course, given the unusual circumstances, but we will face it together." Margaret's stomach churned with anxiety. She had not been part of London society since before her marriage to Giles, and now she would be entering it as a countess, subject to all the scrutiny and judgment that entailed. The image of Lady Constance's cruel smile flashed in Margaret's mind. To endure the ton's cold scrutiny was a profound terror. "I do not know if I am ready," she admitted. "You are ready," Richard assured her, "and I will be beside you." They travelled to London in the Earl's comfortable travelling coach, the boys wide-eyed at the size and bustle of the city. Wycliffe House stood in Mayfair, an imposing townhouse of grey stone with black iron railings and perfectly proportioned windows. "This is ours?" Henry asked, awed. "This is your heritage," Richard corrected gently. "One day you will manage properties like this. It is important you understand the responsibility that comes with privilege." Margaret appreciated that he was teaching the boys to be good stewards rather than spoiled aristocrats. Whatever his faults, Richard took his duties seriously and seemed determined to instill the same sense of responsibility in his heirs. He had been seeking contact with Giles's military colleagues after discovering the marriage certificate, hoping to shore up the evidence for the boy's sake. The first test came 3 days after their arrival, at a ball hosted by the Countess of Ravenwood. Margaret dressed with care in a new gown of deep blue silk that the modiste had assured her was entirely appropriate for a countess. Her maid Sarah arranged her hair in an elegant style, weaving in a sapphire comb that had belonged to Richard's mother. "You look beautiful," Richard said when he came to collect her, and there was genuine appreciation in his gaze. "London society will be talking about the Earl of Wycliffe's remarkable new countess." "I am terrified," Margaret confessed. "I know," Richard replied, "but you have faced far worse than gossiping matrons, and I promise you I will not leave your side." The Ravenwood ballroom blazed with candlelight, reflecting off mirrors and crystal chandeliers. The cream of London society had turned out, elegant ladies in silk and gentlemen in pristine evening dress. Margaret felt the eyes turn toward them as they were announced. "The Earl of Wycliffe and the Countess of Wycliffe." The murmurs started immediately. Margaret held her head high, her hand resting lightly on Richard's arm as he led her into the ballroom. She could feel the weight of judgment, the whispered speculation. "Is that truly her? I heard the marriage was quite sudden." "Where did she come from?" Richard's hand covered hers on his arm, a gesture of support. "Ignore them," he murmured. "They will find something else to gossip about next week." But the worst was yet to come. They had just finished a perfectly correct quadrille when a familiar voice rang out across the ballroom. "My dear nephew," Lady Constance called, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "How delightful to see you in London, though I must confess surprise at your choice of companion." Margaret felt Richard stiffen beside her. His aunt stood near the refreshment tables, surrounded by several other ladies of high rank, all watching the unfolding drama with avid interest. "Aunt Constance," Richard said coolly, "I was not aware you were in town." "Oh, I could not miss the little season," Lady Constance replied, her smile sharp as glass, "particularly not when such interesting developments have occurred in the family. Tell me, is it true that you have married your brother's supposed widow, the one who conveniently appeared after all these years with claims of a secret marriage?" The ladies around her exchanged looks of delighted shock. Every eye in the ballroom was now fixed on the tableau. Margaret forced herself to remain composed, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. This was the confrontation she had dreaded, played out in front of all London society. "I have married my brother's widow," Richard said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom. "The marriage was entirely legitimate, witnessed and documented. My wife is the Countess of Wycliffe, and her sons are my acknowledged heirs." "Such touching faith," Lady Constance said mockingly. "But surely you must wonder, nephew, about a woman who hid herself away for 6 years. What was she hiding from? Or perhaps the better question is, what was she hiding?" "I was hiding from you," Margaret said quietly, her voice shaking but clear. "You threatened to steal my newborn children from me, Lady Constance. You told me my marriage would never be recognized, that my sons would be declared bastards and taken away. I was young, alone and terrified. So yes, I hid to protect my children from your cruelty." The gasps this time were different, conveying shocked sympathy. Lady Constance's face flushed dark red. "You dare to stand there and accuse me of cruelty? You who trapped my nephew into marriage with your schemes? Those children are not legitimate. That marriage certificate is a forgery. Everyone in this room knows—" "The marriage certificate is genuine," a new voice interrupted. "I was there when Captain Giles Thornbury married Margaret Isabel Lawson in March of 1811. I stood witness, along with Lieutenant James Halifax and Sergeant William Cooper. A distinguished gentleman in military dress stepped forward from the crowd. His uniform showed the insignia of a colonel, his bearing that of a man accustomed to command. "Colonel Edmund Fairfax," Richard said with evident relief. "You served with my brother." "I had that honor," Colonel Fairfax replied. "Captain Thornbury was one of the finest officers I have ever known, and he loved his wife desperately." He turned to Lady Constance. "Your nephew spoke of her constantly. He carried her portrait and letters into every battle. Before Waterloo, he updated his will to ensure everything would go to his wife and the children he hoped to meet when he returned home. 2 more men stepped forward, both in military dress. "Lieutenant James Halifax," one introduced himself. "I also witnessed the marriage. It was performed by Chaplain Robert Sterling entirely properly and legally." "Sergeant William Cooper," the third man said. "Captain Thornbury was the best commanding officer I ever served under. He made us promise that if anything happened to him, we would find his wife and make sure she and his children were cared for." "We tried, ma'am," he said directly to Margaret, his weathered face earnest. "We tried to find you after Waterloo, but you had disappeared." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. "I did not know," she whispered. "I did not know anyone was looking." "These men lie," Lady Constance said desperately, but her voice had lost its certainty. "They are suborned witnesses." "We are officers and gentlemen," Colonel Fairfax said coldly, "and we do not appreciate our honor being questioned. The marriage was legitimate. The Countess of Wycliffe is exactly who she claims to be. Anyone who says otherwise will answer to me." "And to me," Lieutenant Halifax added. "And to me," Sergeant Cooper finished. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Every eye was now on Lady Constance, whose face had gone from red to white. Richard's voice, when he spoke, was colder than Margaret had ever heard it. "Aunt Constance, you have repeatedly attempted to discredit my wife and cast doubt on my brother's heirs. You threatened a vulnerable young widow. You attempted to deprive my nephews of their rightful heritage. And now you have publicly insulted not only my wife, but 3 military officers of impeccable reputation." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "I hereby sever all connection between you and the Thornbury family. You are no longer welcome at any property I control. You will receive no support from the family coffers. Your annuity, which was generously provided by my father, is revoked. In short, madam, you are cut off entirely." Lady Constance swayed, her face a mask of shock and fury. "Richard, you cannot—" "I can and I have," Richard said flatly. "Leave this ball, leave London, and pray that I do not take further action regarding your treatment of my wife 6 years ago." Lady Constance opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and fled from the ballroom. The whispers that followed her departure were not kind. Richard turned to Margaret, his expression softening. "Are you well?" She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He had defended her absolutely, without hesitation, in front of all society. He had permanently cut ties with his own blood relation to protect her honor. "Countess," Colonel Fairfax said gently, "your husband was one of the bravest men I knew. He would be very proud of you, I think, and very grateful that his brother has given his family the protection and care they deserve." Margaret curtsied deeply. "Thank you, Colonel. Thank you all. You cannot know what your testimony means." "We know what Captain Thornbury meant to us," Lieutenant Halifax said simply. "This is the least we can do to honor his memory." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur. Society had made its judgment, and it was overwhelmingly in Margaret's favor. The story of the devoted young widow driven into hiding, now vindicated and married to the heroic Earl, was far too romantic for the ton to resist. Lady Ravenwood herself approached Margaret with warmth. "My dear Countess, you must call upon me tomorrow. I should very much like to know you better." Other invitations followed. Margaret found herself accepted, even celebrated, by society's most influential ladies. That night, back at Wycliffe House, Margaret stood at the window of her chamber, staring out at the London streets below. She heard the connecting door open and turned to find Richard entering, still in his evening clothes. "That was quite an evening," he observed. "You defended me," Margaret said. "You cut off your own aunt publicly." "She deserved worse," Richard replied grimly. "What she did to you was unconscionable. I will not tolerate anyone harming my family." "Your family," Margaret repeated softly. "When did I become that to you?" Richard crossed the room to stand beside her at the window. "I think perhaps the moment I saw you standing in my library, terrified but defiant, refusing to cower despite having every reason to fear. You have considerable courage, Margaret." "I was afraid you would take my sons," she admitted. "I know, and I gave you little reason to trust me." He turned to face her fully. I told you this would be a marriage of utility. That sentiment was unnecessary. I find I was grievously mistaken." Margaret felt a powerful surge of hope rise within her. "What are you saying?" "I am saying," Richard said slowly, as though the words were difficult, "that I am beginning to care for you, wife. Far more than I anticipated or intended. Watching you with the boys, seeing your strength and grace, I find myself thinking of you constantly. And tonight, when my aunt attacked you, I felt such fury that she dared hurt you." "Richard," Margaret whispered, "I do not expect you to return the sentiment," he continued. "I know you married me out of necessity, but I wanted you to know that this is no longer simply convenience for me. You have become important to me in ways I did not think possible." Margaret reached up to touch his face, this stern man who had shown her such unexpected tenderness. "I was afraid I would spend my life in a cold marriage," she said, "but you have been kind to me, Richard. Patient and respectful and honorable. I am starting to feel things I did not expect to feel again." "What things?" he asked, his voice rough. "Affection," Margaret admitted. "Trust, and perhaps with time something deeper." Richard gently clasped her against his chest, holding her close. "That is more than I dared hope for." They stood together at the window, watching the night, and Margaret realized that this marriage, born of desperation and necessity, was transforming into something genuine. The months that followed were the happiest Margaret could remember. They returned to Wycliffe Park for winter, where the boys thrived under Richard's patient guidance. He taught them to ride, to hunt, to understand the responsibilities that would one day be theirs. But he also played with them, building snowmen in the gardens and reading stories by the fire. Margaret watched him with her sons and found her esteem and affection deepening with every quiet kindness he showed, falling more deeply in love with him. This was not the wild passion she had shared with Giles, but something steadier, stronger, built on respect and shared purpose. "You are smiling," Richard observed one evening as they sat together in the library after the boys had gone to bed. "I am happy," Margaret replied simply. "I did not think I would ever be happy again after Giles died. But you have given me a life I never imagined possible." "You have given me far more," Richard said, setting aside his book to take her hand. "You have given me a family, Margaret, sons to raise and love, a wife who makes me want to be better than I am. I lived only through the performance of my responsibilities, without lightness. You and the children have shown me what it means to truly live." "I love you," Margaret said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "I know this marriage began as a practical arrangement, but I have fallen in love with you, Richard. I love you with the entirety of the strength and wisdom 6 years of trial gifted me." The joy that lit his face was something she had never seen before, transforming his stern features into something beautiful. "I love you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I think I have loved you since the day you stood in my library and refused to be cowed by threats. You are the strongest, bravest woman I have ever known." He kissed her then, not with the careful restraint of previous encounters, but with genuine passion and love. When they finally drew apart, both were breathless. "Come to bed, wife," Richard murmured. "Let me show you how much I love you." And Margaret went willingly, her heart full of joy and hope for their future together. As the winter yielded to the sun's increased strength, the spring brought new life and the bursting blooms to Wycliffe Park, and Margaret discovered she was expecting a child. "We are going to have a baby?" Henry asked, his eyes wide with wonder. "A brother or sister for you and Edward," Margaret confirmed, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "Will it be a boy or a girl?" Edward demanded. "We cannot know until the baby is born," Richard said, ruffling the boy's hair. "But whichever it is, we will love them just as we love you." The pregnancy was easier than Margaret's first had been, perhaps because she was not alone and terrified this time. Richard maintained a vigilant care of her, ensuring she rested and ate properly and was not overtaxed by her duties. "I am perfectly robust, my lord," Margaret protested one afternoon when he insisted she sit down rather than help with the garden planning. "You are carrying my child," Richard replied firmly. "I will take no chances with either of your well-being. Their daughter Rose was born on a sunny morning in early autumn, A profound stillness settled upon Margaret's chamber after the baby's first cries, the gentle light illuminating the weary peace in her face, a profound contrast to the terror of her first lonely childbirth. When Richard was finally allowed in to meet his daughter, the look on his face was one of pure wonder. "She is perfect," he whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with careful reverence. "She has your eyes," Margaret said, exhausted but happy. "And your beauty," Richard replied, kissing first his daughter's head and then his wife's lips. "Thank you, my love. Thank you for this precious gift." Henry and Edward were equally enchanted with their baby sister, taking their roles as big brothers very seriously. They would sit beside her cradle for hours, telling her stories and promising to protect her always. 18 months after their wedding, Margaret stood in the portrait gallery at Wycliffe Park, watching as the artist made final touches to the family portrait Richard had commissioned. He stood behind her in the painting, one hand on her shoulder, his expression proud and loving. She sat before him, holding baby Rose, while Henry and Edward stood on either side, both growing tall and handsome. "What do you think?" Richard asked, coming to stand beside her in reality as they examined the painted version of their family. "I think it is perfect," Margaret replied. "I think we are perfect." "Not perfect," Richard corrected gently, slipping his arm around her waist. "But ours, and that is far better." Margaret leaned against her husband, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had built together. "I was so afraid when I came here," she admitted. "I thought you were taking my children from me. Instead, you gave us all a home." "You gave me a reason to value the world," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "Before you, I was merely existing, fulfilling duties without joy. You and the children have shown me what it means to truly live." "Mama, Papa," Henry called from across the gallery. "Come see, the artist has finished." They walked together to join their sons, who were admiring the completed portrait with obvious pride. Rose gurgled happily in Richard's arms, grasping at his cravat with chubby fingers. "This will hang here for future generations," Richard said, looking at the portrait. "So they will know the story of how our family began." "Tell them the truth," Margaret said softly. "Tell them that love can come from the most unexpected places, that sometimes the most desperate situations lead to the greatest happiness, that second chances exist for those brave enough to take them." Richard kissed her temple, a gesture of such tenderness that Margaret's heart swelled. "I will tell them that their grandmother was the bravest person I ever knew, that she sacrificed everything to protect her children, and that their grandfather was honored to spend every day of his life proving himself worthy of her love." Edward tugged on Margaret's skirt. "Do you think Papa Giles can see us from heaven?" Margaret knelt to embrace her son. "I think he sees you, and is so very proud of the young man you are becoming. And I think he is grateful that Uncle Richard loves us and cares for us as he would have done." "Will you tell us about Papa Giles tonight?" Henry asked. "Of course," Margaret promised. "I will always tell you about your first father who loved you before you were born." "And about Papa Richard too," Edward added, "about how he saved us and married Mama." "That story too," Margaret agreed, her eyes meeting Richard's over the children's heads. Later that evening, after the boys were tucked into bed and Rose was sleeping peacefully in the nursery, Richard and Margaret stood together on the terrace, overlooking the gardens of Wycliffe Park. The autumn air was cool but pleasant, carrying the scent of roses and earth. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked quietly. "The way we began, the practical arrangement that brought us together?" "Never," Richard said firmly, turning her to face him. "I have regrets about many things in my life, Margaret. Things I did during the war, choices I made, time I wasted. But marrying you, becoming father to those boys, creating this family, those are the things I am most proud of." "I love you," Margaret said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "I love Giles with all my young heart. But I love you with the whole of who I am now, with every part of me that has been tested and strengthened. You have given me everything," Richard whispered against her lips. "Every day with you is a gift I never expected to receive." They stood together in the gathering darkness, two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances, who had built a family from desperation and duty and transformed it into something profoundly rooted. Inside the house, Henry and Edward slept peacefully, dreaming of the adventures they would have tomorrow. Baby Rose breathed softly in her cradle, surrounded by love. And in the portrait gallery, the painting showed a family united, proof that sometimes the most precious things in life come not from careful planning, but from having the courage to take chances on unexpected paths. Margaret had hidden for 6 years in fear, believing she had lost everything when Giles died. But standing here in Richard's arms, surrounded by the life they had built together, she understood a profound truth. She had not lost everything. She had been given the opportunity to find something new, something equally precious, but different. Love did not come in only one form. It could be passionate and wild like her first marriage, or it could grow slowly, steadily, from respect and shared purpose into something deep and steadfast. Both were real. Both were valuable. Both were love. "Come to bed, my love," Richard murmured, taking her hand. And Margaret went with him, her heart full of gratitude for second chances, for unexpected blessings, and for the man who had taken a terrified widow and her children and given them not just security, but a true home. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of love, resilience, and hope.